In the late 1990s, a man with a heavy Russian accent approached American intelligence officer Brian Kelly. He offered Kelly a passport and a way to escape. For someone who had genuinely been approached by a foreign intelligence service, the correct response was obvious. Kelly reported the contact immediately, and the FBI treated that as another reason to suspect him. Because the Russian was not Russian intelligence. He was working for the FBI. The entire encounter had been a trap. By then, American counterintelligence had spent years trying to understand who was destroying operations from inside the system. Sources had been exposed. Sensitive operations had collapsed. Information known to only a small circle of people was reaching the Soviet side. Somewhere inside the American intelligence apparatus, there was a mole. Investigators gave him a deliberately forgettable code name, Gray Suit. Then they tried to turn the hunt into mathematics. The FBI and CIA built a matrix with 62 criteria. Names ran along one axis, compromised operations and access ran along the other. The logic was simple. The more failed operations a person could have known about, the higher that person moved on the list. 245 CIA officers became 50, 50 became 34, 34 became 17 key suspects. Robert Hanssen was not one of them. Brian Kelly, on the other hand, began to fit the pattern almost too well. In 1989, Kelly happened to be in Paris during the same period as Felix Bloch, an American diplomat suspected of contact with Soviet intelligence, and a man someone had managed to warn that he was under surveillance. The coincidence went into the case. Then investigators found a marked map of Nottoway Park. A park. Marked locations. Exactly the kind of environment where a spy might use dead drops. Except Kelly used the map for running. The marks were his jogging routes. Even the polygraphs failed to rescue him. Kelly remained calm and repeatedly passed the tests. Instead of weakening the theory, his composure helped create a new one. Perhaps he was simply too well trained to break. Investigators began calling him the Iceman. At that point, almost anything could be interpreted in two directions. If Kelly looked nervous, he might be hiding something. If he stayed calm, he might be disciplined enough to defeat the test. If he failed to report a suspicious contact, that would look incriminating. But when he reported one immediately, perhaps he had simply realized he was being tested. Once a theory reaches that point, evidence can begin moving in only one direction. After a covert search of Kelly's home, he noticed something on the carpet, a tiny screw. FBI technicians installing surveillance equipment had accidentally left it behind. One insignificant piece of metal, but to Kelly, it meant someone had been inside his house. And all the while, the real problem was somewhere else. The investigation had not merely chosen the wrong man, it had begun with the wrong assumption. Because the compromised sources and failed operations were closely tied to the CIA and Moscow, the search kept pulling investigators back toward the CIA. A matrix can become incredibly precise and still produce the wrong answer if the right person was barely inside the search to begin with. Robert Hanssen did not work for the CIA. He worked for the FBI. In the spring of 1979, Robert Hanssen maneuvered his way into the FBI unit handling Soviet intelligence in New York. 5 months later, he walked into a building at 240 Madison Avenue. It housed Amtorg, a Soviet trading organization that had long attracted the attention of American counterintelligence. Hanssen had already checked one useful detail. The entrance itself was not covered by FBI surveillance. He walked in from the street, handed a surprised duty officer a typewritten letter, and disappeared back into Manhattan. There had been no elaborate recruitment. No Soviet officer had spent months cultivating him. No one had gone looking for Robert Hanssen. He had gone looking for them. The letter offered his services and contained information that could only have come from someone with genuine access to classified material. Among the information he provided was the identity of Dmitry Polyakov, one of America's most valuable sources inside Soviet military intelligence. What followed is almost as important as the decision itself. Hanssen's legitimate access inside his own government kept expanding. In New York, he helped computerize information on Soviet diplomats and intelligence officers. He spent hours inside the FBI's files on Soviet espionage. Later, he moved to FBI headquarters in Washington. Work involving budgets and sensitive programs gave him visibility into another layer of the intelligence system: technical operations, classified expenditures, special programs, and information distributed across different parts of the government. Then came analytical work focused on the Soviet Union. Hanssen did not have to break into a vault to reach secrets. The system kept handing him the keys. He also understood computers unusually well for an FBI agent of his generation. Colleagues remembered him grasping systems and concepts long before many people around him were comfortable using them. Sometimes he demonstrated that knowledge in ways that should have been difficult to ignore. In one episode, Hanssen penetrated a supervisor's computer, obtained access to a sensitive document, printed it elsewhere, and made sure the result could be seen. His point was that the FBI's computer security was vulnerable. The response was remarkably mild. In another incident, in 1985, Hanssen was discovered copying material from the debriefing of Soviet defector Vitaly Yurchenko, material he was not supposed to be copying. Again, the episode did not become the beginning of a serious security investigation. He was reprimanded. Work continued. Years later, investigators would use a phrase for irregularities like these: puffs of smoke. One puff could be explained: an eccentric employee, a computer specialist proving a point, a man who was too curious, a colleague bending procedure. But the smoke kept appearing. By the late 1980s, Hanssen was close enough to the FBI's work on Soviet intelligence failures to see how the Bureau was thinking about internal leaks. Sources differ on the exact title and scope of his role during this period. Some describe work connected to an internal mole study. Others place him in Soviet analytical and supervisory positions. The distinction matters for his job title. It matters much less for what he could see. He had access to the institution's thinking about betrayal from inside the institution itself. And even when people pointed in his direction, the fragments failed to become a case. After FBI agent Earl Pitts was arrested for espionage in the 1990s, Pitts reportedly told investigators they should take a closer look at Hanssen. They did not build a full investigation around the warning. Earlier, a relative of Hanssen who also worked for the FBI had raised concerns about unusual behavior and unexplained circumstances. The sources disagree over exactly when that warning was made, how formally it was delivered, and how seriously it was received. The result was simpler. Hanssen remained where he was. He was not a man who left no traces. The traces existed. They appeared in different offices, in different years, inside different pieces of paperwork, and almost every one of them could be explained on its own. Meanwhile, his access continued to grow. By the next stage of the story, knowing FBI secrets was no longer his greatest advantage. He was beginning to understand something more valuable: how the FBI looked for someone who knew its secrets. On an ordinary weekend, Robert Hanssen could open the FBI's payroll system and look for something most employees would barely notice: overtime. If a group of agents suddenly started collecting extra hours on a Saturday or Sunday, it could mean a surveillance operation was being prepared. To Hanssen, administrative payroll data became an early warning system. He was looking for signs of the hunt before the hunt began. That was part of what made him so difficult to catch. Hanssen did not only know FBI secrets, he knew FBI habits. When the Bureau moved toward its automated case system, ACS, Hanssen quickly learned to use the internal database for his own protection. He searched for his own name, his home address on Talisman Drive, locations connected to places he used. According to the research material, during one period he ran variations of those searches 9 times. If nothing appeared, that was information too. The FBI still was not looking at him. His protection did not depend on becoming completely invisible. It depended on constantly checking where everyone else was looking. Hanssen even liked to talk about a decision cycle built around observing, orienting, deciding, and acting. He argued that Soviet intelligence gained an advantage when it moved through that cycle faster than its opponent. His own secret life followed much the same logic: observe, check, adjust, then observe again. But computers were only one layer. Hanssen also designed his communication with Soviet intelligence to require as little direct human contact as possible. Instead of meetings, there could be newspapers. Instead of conversations, predetermined phrases. Instead of addresses, parks. Instead of obvious signals, tape, thumbtacks, chalk, and garbage bags. In 1986, an advertisement appeared in the Washington Times. A 1971 Dodge Diplomat was supposedly for sale. It needed engine work. The asking price was $1,000. To almost every reader, it was a forgettable classified ad. To Hanssen, it was a signal. He could call the number in the advertisement and use an agreed phrase about the car. No mention of the KGB,
No mention of documents. No explanation of who was really speaking to whom. To anyone listening casually, it sounded like a man calling about an old Dodge. Another layer of protection was built into his instructions. Hanssen used a system known as +or-6. A date or time written in a message did not necessarily mean the real date or time. 6 had to be added or subtracted. 1 in the afternoon, for example, could mean 7 in the evening. It was not sophisticated cryptography. That was partly the point. It was simple enough to use without specialized equipment, and strange enough that an intercepted instruction could not simply be read literally. Most physical exchanges happened through dead drops. Hanssen used parks across northern Virginia: Nottoway, Idlewood, Eakin, Foxstone. The locations acquired code names of their own: Prime, Charlie, Ellis. Documents and money could be placed inside packages made to look like ordinary trash. Hanssen instructed his Soviet contacts to use green or brown garbage bags and to cover packages with real debris. The less important something looked, the safer it became. Small markers on park signs or wooden posts could signal that an action had been completed. The sources disagree on the exact meaning assigned to different orientations of the white tape, so the more important point is the mechanism itself. A few inches of tape on an ordinary sign could carry a message, if you knew where to look. When investigators eventually searched Hanssen's car, they also found other primitive signaling tools: chalk and colored thumbtacks. Some of the most damaging espionage in American history depended partly on objects that could have come from an office supply store. Hanssen also chose locations with an unusual logic. One drop site was close enough to home that he could monitor the surrounding area almost as a neighbor. His reasoning effectively turned proximity into protection. If the FBI ever needed prolonged surveillance near that location, being the man who lived nearby could itself become useful. But none of this made the system perfect.
At one point, Soviet intelligence left $50,000 for him at Long Branch Nature Center. Hanssen could not find it. Other exchanges were disrupted by confusion over exactly where a package had been placed near a bridge. The tradecraft was careful. It was not magic. Its strength came from reducing the number of moments when another human being could physically see Robert Hanssen beside a Soviet intelligence officer. Fewer meetings meant fewer witnesses. Simple signals meant less direct communication, and access to FBI systems gave him a chance to notice changes around him before those changes became an arrest team. By then, Hanssen's secret life had become almost a parallel infrastructure: databases to check for danger, a newspaper to send a signal, a numerical rule to disguise time, parks to exchange material, a few inches of white tape to confirm that something had happened. All of that caution existed for one reason. What exactly was valuable enough to require this much protection? On Wisconsin Avenue, directly across from the new Soviet embassy in Washington, stood an ordinary brick house. In its basement, a tunnel began. FBI and NSA technicians would lie flat on a low platform and travel along narrow rails beneath the ground toward the Soviet compound. The operation was called Monopoly. It required enormous resources and extraordinary secrecy. Soil removed from the tunnel was carried away at night and, according to the research material, mixed with earth being excavated by the Soviets during construction of their own embassy. The Soviets were already expecting attempts to penetrate the building. Steel components were examined with X-rays. Thick slabs of marble were demanded for interior walls, making it harder to hide listening devices inside the structure. But the most dangerous weakness was not in the concrete or the steel. It was inside the FBI. In 1989, Hanssen disclosed the existence of Operation Monopoly to the Soviet side. After that, the Americans could no longer trust what the tunnel might produce. An operation that had consumed extraordinary effort and money had lost its intelligence value. That was one secret. Some of the others had a price that could not be measured in equipment. In 1985, Hanssen provided the identities of people secretly working for the United States inside the Soviet system. Among them were Valery Martinov and Sergei Motorin. Both men were recalled to Moscow. Both were executed. Another source, Boris Yuzhin, received a 15-year prison sentence. He served 6 years before being released and later made his way to the United States. On paper, these were names. To counterintelligence officers, they were assets. To the Soviet state, they were traitors. But for the people whose identities appeared inside Hanssen's material, a single line on a classified page could mean prison or death. Human sources were only one category of what he exposed. Hanssen also passed information revealing how the United States collected intelligence and how the FBI monitored Soviet personnel. technical programs, methods used in covert searches, technology for tracking vehicles, information about American measurement and detection capabilities. He even compromised material connected to continuity of government, plans designed to keep the American leadership functioning after a catastrophic attack. This was no longer the loss of a single operation. It was a map of how the system protected itself. Hanssen could provide more than a secret. He could provide the instructions behind the secret, how the intelligence had been collected, what technology made it possible, where the vulnerability was, and what the United States considered important enough to protect most carefully. Later estimates placed the cost of rebuilding compromised programs and capabilities in the billions of dollars, but there is no clean number for the real damage. What is the price of a source who no longer exists? A tunnel that can no longer be trusted. A surveillance technique the other side now understands. By the end of the 1990s, the FBI already knew damage on this scale had occurred. It knew someone had been feeding secrets out of the system, and it was still building its case against the wrong man. At some point, the investigation of Brian Kelly stopped being only about Brian Kelly. His daughter Erin worked for the CIA. Investigators brought her in and told her directly her father was working for the Russians. Kelly's son was questioned too, according to the research material, just after the birth of his first child. The investigation was no longer simply testing a hypothesis. It was reorganizing an entire family's life around the assumption that the mole had already been found. And that created a dangerous problem. The more time, people, and institutional credibility invested in Kelly, the harder it became to consider that the theory itself might be wrong. By the end of the 1990s, American counterintelligence needed something another analytical model could not provide. They needed someone from the other side. Someone who could open a Soviet archive and show them not a theory about the mole, but the mole's own traces. That person became known to the Americans as Mr. Pym. The research material identifies him as Alexander Shcherbakov, a former Soviet intelligence officer. Approaching him directly was risky, so the Americans built a cover around art. Shcherbakov dealt in Russian Palek lacquer miniatures. In New York, a meeting was arranged with a man who was supposed to look like an American art dealer. The role was played by former FBI agent Bill Stout. His fee for the performance was $500. On the table were genuine pieces of Palek art. 5 objects later described by experts as authentic and high quality. To anyone watching, this was a business meeting, but the Americans were not really interested in the boxes. They wanted the archive. Later conversations moved beyond the art. One account places a major approach over an expensive dinner. Another describes a crucial conversation in an Irish bar over Tullamore Dew, a whiskey the agents jokingly turned into, "Tell me more, dude." The reported price of the information varies dramatically. One source gives roughly $1 million, others give $7 million. Eric O'Neill later described a figure as high as $14 million when the wider operation was included. So the safest conclusion is also the simplest. The United States was prepared to spend millions to see the file of its own traitor, and Shcherbakov gave them the file. There was no convenient photograph labeled Robert Hanssen. What arrived was more interesting than that. Letters, old operational material, physical evidence, and an audio recording of a telephone call made all the way back in 1986. The material had to be carried from Moscow to Washington. According to the research accounts, the CIA officer transporting the package across the Atlantic refused to let it out of her hands. She even slept while holding it against her body. Inside that package was something years of American analysis had failed to produce on its own: a human trace. On Saturday, November 18, 2000, the material was being examined inside a small, secure room on the 4th floor of FBI headquarters. Accounts describe it as a little triangular vault. Investigators began working through the anonymous source's letters. Then one phrase caught their attention. The writer had used a crude expression associated with General Patton. To most people, it was simply an unusual line. But men who had worked around Hanssen had heard language like it before. For the first time, the unknown mole was beginning to sound like a person they knew. Jim Milburn grabbed a pink index card and wrote down a name. In the rush, he misspelled it. Hanssen, 1S. A tiny spelling error made at the moment the investigation was finally beginning to point in the right direction. But language could be coincidence. Someone could imitate a phrase. The Americans had something better: a cassette. It contained a telephone conversation between the secret source and Soviet officer Alexander Fefilov, recorded back in 1986. The investigators put on the recording. The sources disagree over exactly who recognized the voice first. One account gives Milburn that moment, another names a different FBI officer, but they agree on the important part. Recognition came fast. According to several accounts, it took 41 seconds. The man who had spent years outside the center of the investigation suddenly had a voice, and the voice belonged to Robert Hanssen. Then came something physical. Among the material was a black plastic bag connected to an earlier dead drop. On the inside was a fingerprint, a right thumbprint. It matched Hanssen.
A phrase, a voice, a fingerprint.
None of them looked like a spectacular intelligence breakthrough on its own. They were tiny things. The same kind of tiny things Hanssen had spent years using to remain hidden. Now the details were beginning to turn against him. The theory built around Brian Kelly could no longer explain the evidence better than the man the FBI had barely been looking at. After years of searching, American counterintelligence finally had the name of its mole. But a name was not enough. Knowing who the spy was and proving that a serving FBI agent was still working for Russian intelligence were two very different problems, especially when that agent had spent his career learning how the FBI hunted people. Now the Bureau had to do something much more dangerous. It had to build a cage around Robert Hanssen without letting him see it closing. By December of 2000, the investigation had a new code name, Gray Day. The FBI was no longer trying to discover the identity of the traitor, it was trying to watch Robert Hanssen, without Robert Hanssen realizing he was being watched. That was a different problem. Hanssen had spent much of his career studying the very methods now being used against him. He understood surveillance procedures, he understood internal computer systems, and he had spent years looking for small changes that might warn him an operation was moving in his direction. Ordinary surveillance was not enough, so the FBI decided to change the environment around him. In January of 2001, Hanssen was offered a new position inside FBI headquarters. On paper, it looked attractive. There was even the possibility of entering the Senior Executive Service, one of the highest levels of federal management, and avoiding the approaching mandatory retirement that came with his age. But the position had another purpose: put Hanssen somewhere the FBI could control. He was moved into room 9930 on the 9th floor of headquarters. The office was effectively built around the investigation. According to the research material, 42 workers were involved in preparing the space, most without knowing its real purpose. Drywall was deliberately left unfinished during the first night, so technical teams could place surveillance equipment behind the walls. The room became so saturated with monitoring technology that one member of the operation later joked you could cook a chicken inside it like a microwave. Cameras, however, could only do so much. The FBI needed someone inside the room. His name was Eric O'Neill. He was 27 years old. O'Neill worked as an investigative specialist in the FBI's Special Surveillance Group, a surveillance unit whose members were known inside the Bureau as the Ghosts. He understood computers, and now he was assigned to become Hanssen's young assistant. Not an interrogator, not a security officer, not someone who looked like he was there to investigate anything, just the man sitting nearby. That gave the operation something a hidden camera could not. Someone who could notice what Hanssen carried, when he left, what he touched, and when his belongings were unattended. At the same time, the FBI faced another problem. Hanssen had spent years using Bureau computer systems to understand where investigators were looking. Simply cutting off his access could warn him immediately. So, according to the research material, the FBI created a mirrored ACS environment for the operation. Hanssen could continue searching and working, but now his own activity inside the system could be watched without alerting him. The man who had used FBI infrastructure as a radar was finally appearing on the radar himself. The operation extended to his car. Hanssen drove a silver 1997 Ford Taurus. When investigators found a safe opportunity, technicians could remove the car from the FBI headquarters garage and search it. A replacement vehicle could occupy its space while the real Taurus was being examined. But moving the car created one tiny problem: mileage. If the Taurus traveled even a short distance during the search, its odometer changed, and Hanssen was exactly the kind of person investigators feared might notice. So the technicians compensated for the movement manually: 1/10 of a mile, 0.1. A distance most drivers would never think to check. But this entire operation was being built around a man whose survival depended on noticing what other people dismissed. Tiny details were no longer tiny.
Inside room 9930, O'Neill was learning another kind of pattern. Hanssen constantly clicked his favorite Dr. Pilot Grip Sport pen. When he stood up, he would jingle the keys in his pocket. He went to the firing range in the basement. Then he came back. O'Neill needed more than a general idea of that routine. He needed time. So he ran through FBI headquarters with a stopwatch. Elevators, stairs, hallways, the distance to the range, how long it might take Hanssen to return. O'Neill calculated a window of roughly 9 minutes in which someone could risk touching Hanssen's possessions. But one of the most important objects in Hanssen's bag would require longer: a Palm Pilot 3, a small electronic organizer inside a leather case.
On February 15, 2001, Hanssen went to the firing range again. O'Neill took the device and ran. From the 9th floor toward the technical team waiting elsewhere in the building, the specialists had only minutes. They needed to extract information without leaving a visible change and return the device exactly as it had been found. The entire operation took about 17 minutes, longer than the safe window O'Neill had calculated. By the time he carried the Palm Pilot back toward Hanssen's office, there was almost no margin left. He returned the device to the bag, sat at his computer, and according to his own account, pretended to work on a memorandum while trying to keep his face completely ordinary. Hanssen came back. He walked toward his belongings and began checking them. The Palm Pilot was where he had left it. The data inside gave investigators information connected to Hanssen's future activity. The FBI was no longer simply watching the man it believed was the mole. It now had a chance to anticipate his next move. For years, Hanssen had tried to see the hunters before the hunters could see him. Now the relationship had finally reversed. They knew where he was going. All they had to do was let him go there. On Sunday, February 18, 2001, Robert Hanssen pulled into the parking lot at Pike 7 Plaza in Northern Virginia. He was driving his silver Ford Taurus. Around him, it looked like an ordinary Sunday. Cars, shoppers, people returning to their trunks with bags. Hanssen opened his own trunk and began preparing his final package. He wrapped classified documents with tape and placed them inside a black garbage bag. From a distance, the scene looked almost absurdly ordinary. A man standing beside his car, packing something into the trunk. But this time, FBI agents were watching, not because of an analytical model, not because of a suspicious coincidence, not because someone thought he fit a profile. They were watching a man they now believed was the mole, and waiting for a physical act they could prove. Hanssen left the shopping center and drove toward Foxstone Park. The location had existed inside his secret system for years under one code name, Ellis. A wooden path, Wolf Trap Creek, a pedestrian bridge, an ordinary suburban park, and hidden around it, FBI agents Hanssen was not supposed to see. He reached the signaling point and left a strip of white tape, the same primitive language that could communicate without a conversation. Then he moved toward the bridge. The package went beneath the wooden structure. 22 years of espionage had now been reduced to one physical object beneath a bridge: documents, a garbage bag, a few steps back toward a car. Hanssen turned and started walking away. The arrest team moved. Agents came out of concealment and surrounded him. The FBI had prepared for the possibility of violence. Hanssen owned weapons, and the team could not assume he would surrender quietly. But he did not resist. His final dead drop was over. Accounts disagree about the first words Hanssen spoke after his arrest. One version has him asking, "What took you so long?" Another remembers, "So this is how it goes." A third says he calmly told the agents that guns would not be necessary. There may never be one perfect cinematic line for that moment, but the important fact is not disputed. Hanssen had been caught immediately after leaving the package. Later that day, the FBI allowed him to call his wife. Agents listened, alert for a final coded warning. None came. Within months, Hanssen pleaded guilty to 15 charges. The agreement spared him the death penalty. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. And the case against Brian Kelly finally collapsed. The FBI would later send Kelly a formal letter of apology. Kelly had been the man the system spent years forcing into its theory. Hanssen had been the man that same system spent years barely considering. And in the end, Hanssen was not exposed by one spectacular mistake. Not a confession, not a dramatic meeting with a Russian officer. He was surrounded by a chain of small things. An old recording, a fingerprint inside a garbage bag, searches inside a database, 1/10 of a mile, a Palm Pilot, a strip of white tape.
For 22 years, Robert Hanssen survived by noticing details before everyone else did. In the end, the FBI caught him the same way.